One, thank you for coming. Welcome to the Institute for Science, Technology, and Public Policy's Bush School 25th Anniversary Celebration, honoring President Bush's support of environmental policies during and after his presidency. The Institute for Science, Technology, and Public Policy has been with the Bush School for 23 of the Bush School's 25 years. We are very proud of that close, deep relationship. I am so pleased to introduce our speaker for this remembrance of President Bush. Dr. Joel Sharaga is a friend and colleague we in the Institute for Science, Technology, and Public Policy have worked with for over 25 years. It is so appropriate for Dr. Sharaga to speak as part of the celebration for the 25th anniversary of the Bush School, because in his life and career, Joel has epitomized the public-serving, community-spirited public servant that President Bush himself was and that he wanted for our young people. In his distinguished career at US EPA, Joel has worked tirelessly and fearlessly to continue the work started by President Bush in 1989 of making a special effort in protecting our air and water resources and the health of our citizens and nation in the face of a changing climate. Dr. Sharaga is exactly the kind of public servant that President Bush wanted all the graduates of the Bush School to be. One committed to fairness, knowledge, truth, and community service. President Bush would be proud of what Dr. Sharaga has done for our nation, and even prouder of his affiliation with the Bush School and Texas A&M University. Dr. Sharaga, we are so happy to have you join us today on the anniversary of President Bush's signing of the Clean Air Act amendments as we celebrate the environmental accomplishments and legacy of President Bush. Thank you for your service to our nation. Dr. Sharaga.
Thank you very much, Arnie, for that very, very kind introduction. And it's truly an honor and a privilege for me to be here today with all of you on this 25th anniversary of the Bush School of Government and Public Service, and on this 32nd anniversary of the signing by President Bush of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. I particularly want to thank Arnie Vedlitz for this opportunity to spend some time with all of you today. Arnie himself has been a visionary leader of the Institute for Science, Technology, and Public Policy for many years, as well as a really terrific colleague for over 20 years. And time flies, Arnie, doesn't it? First slide, please, Grant. All too often, with the passage of time, we tend to forget some of the major environmental challenges that this nation has faced in the past, and the landmark legislation that was passed to address those issues. And in my presentation today, I wanted to take us back over 30 years to the Bush administration and remind us of the major environmental challenges that President Bush faced as soon as he took office, and also highlight for you the major steps the president took to tackle those problems. Next slide, please. Now, I joined the EPA in 1987, and I've had the privilege of serving the American people under 7 different presidents. And from that vantage point, I've not only had the opportunity to observe the leadership of presidents like President Bush as they confronted enormous threats like climate change to our environment and public health, but also to see the lasting legacy of their efforts long after they left office. Now, after sharing with you some of President Bush's landmark achievements accomplished in a bipartisan way during his administration, I also want to focus on his legacy, which is the foundation he helped build, upon which we are making great strides today to protect public health and the environment in the United States and globally as well. And I'll also touch very briefly on the influence President Bush's administration had on my own career path to show you the impact a leader like the president can have on the youth of today. Next slide, please. Now, I would be remiss if I also didn't acknowledge right at the outset the leadership of Bill Riley, who President Bush appointed as administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Bill Riley was and still is a passionate environmentalist. And it really is to President Bush's credit that he appointed an environmentalist like Bill Riley to lead the EPA during his entire administration. And I must say, Administrator Riley played a major role advancing President Bush's environmental agenda. Next slide, please. Now, immediately upon taking office, President Bush was confronted with at least 3 major environmental challenges. 2 months after he took office, on March 24th, 1989, the oil tanker Exxon Valdez ran aground in Prince William Sound in Alaska, spilling 11 million gallons of oil into the ocean. And given the ecological sensitivity of the location, the season of the year, and the huge amount of oil that was spilled, it resulted in one of the largest environmental disasters in US history. And contributing to that was Prince William Sound's remote location, which is accessible only by helicopter or plane or boat, which made response efforts by the government and industry very, very difficult, and also made existing response plans back then especially hard to implement. And I'll talk about more in a minute about how the president dealt with this. But sadly, it is now the 2nd largest oil spill in US waters after the 2010 Deep Horizon or BP oil spill. Next, turning to acid rain. During this same period of time, the nation was grappling with the threats of acid rain. And for those of you unfamiliar with this problem, acid rain results from when sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides are emitted into the atmosphere. And most of that comes from the burning of fossil fuels. Not all of it, but most of it comes from the burning of fossil fuels, from things like utilities, manufacturing processes, and from automobile emissions. And once emitted into the atmosphere, these pollutants can be transported over very long distances by wind and air currents, for example, from the Midwest all the way to the East Coast. Now, why back then were we so concerned about this thing called acid rain? Very simply, because it can have huge detrimental impacts on things like our rivers and lakes and streams. It can kill fish. It destroys forests and trees. It can even do things like causing paint to peel, like on your own homes. And that actually is a huge problem. It can cause steel structures like that on bridges to corrode over time. It can degrade stone buildings and sculptures and monuments, things like our monuments here in Washington, D.C. And of course, it can also affect human health. Now, going all the way back to 1980, the Congress passed the Acid Precipitation Act and created something called the National Acid Precipitation Program, or NAPAP for short, to begin to study this problem. We were just beginning to understand the severity of the problem. The point is that between 1980 and 1990, there was a recognition that something had to be done, but policy actions had not yet been taken by the time President Bush took office. Finally, the third major challenge the nation was beginning to face was climate change. The nation was beginning to get a sense for the threats posed by climate change to public health, the environment, the economy, and our social well-being. So those are the 3 major challenges that President Bush immediately faced. I like to think about it as welcome to the White House, Mr. President. I will say, though, President Bush didn't shy away from these challenges. Next slide. Let's take a deeper look at that. Working with the Congress, President Bush proposed sweeping revisions to the Clean Air Act. Again, for those of you who may not be fully aware of what the Clean Air Act is about, it's the federal law passed by Congress that regulates air emissions from stationary sources like power utilities and from mobile sources like from the cars and the trucks that we drive. And among other things, it also is the law that authorizes EPA to regulate emissions of hazardous pollutants in order to protect public health and the environment. President Bush recognized as soon as he came into office that the Clean Air Act needed to be strengthened to deal with the threats of acid rain. In addition, the Congress also recognized that the emissions of chemicals that deplete stratospheric ozone, causing the so-called ozone hole, also had to be curbed. All of that was blended into the amendments, as well as an innovative market scheme for dealing with sulfur dioxide emissions. And all of this led to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, which President Bush signed on this day, November 15th, back in 1990. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see the actual signing ceremony. President Bush signing the Clean Air Act amendments, and that's Bill Riley over the president's right-hand shoulder. Next slide. So again, the president immediately confronted the acid rain problem. Now I want to pause and emphasize, and you'll hear this theme throughout my presentation. I want to emphasize that this major piece of legislation was based on sound science. Policy decisions were linked to sound scientific research in the same way that the Institute for Science, Technology, and Public Policy at Texas A&M focuses on linking science with policy. Now, I mentioned earlier how the Congress created the NAPAP program in 1980. And over that 10-year period, from 1980 to 1990, the NAPAP program advanced our scientific understanding of both the causes and the effects of acid rain. The highlight of all this work, though, the highlight of the 27 science and technology reports that were produced, was the final major integrated assessment report that it produced to inform policy decisions that led to the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. And as you can see, it was finally published in 1990, but there was an ongoing dialogue between the NAPAP program and the Congress and the administrations about their findings about the hazards and risks posed by acid rain. Now, I must say, I personally had the opportunity to work on the NAPAP assessment. And again, I have to say it was a transformative time in my career. It helped me to understand the different approaches for linking science with policy, for informing decisions with the best available science and in a timely fashion, not waiting for the science to be absolutely perfect, because the science is never perfect, but helping policymakers make smart, well-informed decisions. And I then carried these lessons into the work I then started to do on climate change. So I just wanted to share with all of you that for me personally, this is part of President Bush's legacy. And I am where I am today as EPA's senior advisor on climate adaptation, partly because of the opportunity to work on the NAPAP assessment and also the climate change programs I then had the opportunity to be part of over the subsequent years benefited as well. Next slide, please. I want to briefly return to the Exxon Valdez disaster. I mean, it was horrific. After the oil spill, there was a recognition on the part of both the American people who were horrified and the US Congress that our ability to prevent and respond to oil spills had to be improved. And when they do occur, we needed to improve our ability to restore the nation's water and shorelines. Under President Bush's leadership, again, the Congress passed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, which President Bush signed in August 1990. Next slide, please. Again, wanted to share with you an actual photograph of President Bush signing this legislation in the Oval Office on August 18th, 1990. Next slide. Finally, turning to the climate crisis, President Bush and the Congress began to confront the challenge of climate change during his administration. The Congress asked the EPA back then to produce two major reports, landmark reports. The first one, which you can see on the left, focused on the potential impacts of climate change on the United States to help us understand back then the magnitude of the problem, to get a sense for what climate change means for human health, for people like you and me and in our health, for the quality of the air we breathe and the water that we drink, for our ecosystems, for forests, for agricultural production of food that we need to eat, and much, much more. The other report, which you see on the right, came out in 1990, and it looked at the policy options for reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. And again, I was privileged to work on both of these projects. And the reason I raise that is I could see firsthand the leadership being provided by the Bush administration and within EPA by Linda Fisher, the head of the policy office at the time, who at EPA, who was my boss in the production of the reports. And I have to say, I even had the privilege of working with Linda to prepare her congressional testimony about the findings of the reports. And she was very straightforward with Congress about the impacts that we could see already occurring and anticipated would occur in the future because of climate change. So again, these reports, along with work being done by other federal agencies back then, helped to form the foundation upon which the entire federal government and the nation is confronting this huge environmental challenge even today. Next slide. But again, and this is a theme you're going to keep hearing from me, I can't overemphasize the recognition by President Bush and the Congress of basing policy decisions on sound science, and even having the vision that we're going to continue to deal with this climate change problem for many, many years, and we need to continue to improve the science. As you can see from the quote from the late Senator Ernest Hollings, there was a recognition at that time of the need to start confronting the challenge of climate change, but also to advance over time our understanding, our scientific understanding of the problem. So for this reason, President Bush signed into law the Global Change Research Act of 1990 that created the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which we call the USGCRP. And to this day, because of that act, which President Bush signed, the USGCRP continues to produce national climate assessments to inform the nation's policies on climate change, not just policies being made at the federal level, but also decisions being made at the state and local and levels and by tribal governments. Next slide. Again, this is part of the legacy. Finally, it was at this time that at a global scale, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is called the IPCC for short, and the IPCC is the international body that works to advance our scientific understanding of climate change by all nations, produced its first climate change assessment report in order to inform international negotiations. The reason I'm highlighting this, not just to share with you how all of this was beginning to happen during President Bush's administration, but also because it's notable that the Bush administration supported participation by federal scientists like myself in the IPCC assessment processes. The bottom line, it was during the Bush administration that the nation and the entire international community really started to confront the climate crisis. Next slide, please. Now, I confess that as I prepared for this talk, it was a rush for me. All of these activities that occurred during the Bush administration came rushing back. And it caused me to really pause and begin to reflect on President Bush's legacy. How all these events, as I mentioned earlier, how all these events laid the foundation for the important work we're doing today in order to protect public health and the environment. And also the foundation that is leading to the training of the next generation of leaders to lead this nation's efforts to combat and confront these major environmental challenges. Next slide. Without question, and it's been my privilege to be involved with the Institute, but without question, a major legacy for President Bush was the creation of the Institute for Science, Technology, and Public Policy at Texas A&M University. I've spoken a lot about the critical importance of informing policy decisions with the best available scientific information and doing so in an unbiased way. I have to say, knowing how to do this is a critically important skill. And the Institute is helping to train the next generation of leaders in this area. And I applaud what the Institute is doing along those lines. The Institute has also undertaken some enormously important research. And as you can see from the list I've provided here, one of those projects is an EPA-supported project. We at the EPA value the Institute's expertise, and we've worked with them in the past. And in fact, sort of piecing all these things together, the EPA-supported project I've highlighted here was an important component of the first U.S. National Climate Assessment that was produced by the U.S. Global Change Research Program in 2000. Next slide. Linking to that, I mentioned earlier again how President Bush signed into law in 1990 the creation of the U.S. Global Change Research Program and how the U.S. GCRP produces national climate assessments on a periodic basis. What you see here is the first such assessment that, as I said, came out in October of 2000. It was a landmark undertaking because it didn't just contain a report from the federal government. It also contained over 20 regional and tribal assessments produced by universities and tribes across the nation. Those regional assessments, which stakeholders in the region produced themselves, given the issues of concern to them, those regional assessments and tribal assessments increase the understanding of the American people of the threats posed by climate change to the nation and to the things that they care about on the ground every single day. It was a game changer. And the Institute's project, which I highlighted on the previous slide, contributed to the Gulf Coast Regional Assessment, which EPA sponsored. So again, the Institute played a major role in this activity. And I must say, Arnie Vedlitz led that effort. Next slide. Now, moving forward in time, and I want to move forward very quickly, this work has continued over time, building on this foundation. It continued into President George W. Bush's administration as the U.S. Global Change Research Program continued to produce 21 synthesis and assessment products, again, with the goal of informing decision makers and policy decisions. So the work continued, and I do have to pause for a minute and acknowledge the late Dr. James Mahoney, who was the political head of the U.S. Global Change Research Program at the time. Jim had also been the former director of the NAPAP program, so he truly understands how to advance scientific understanding in order to inform decisions in a timely way. And I also wanted to mention that because Jim was a mentor of mine, and he really worked very hard to ensure that this critical research continued to proceed. And obviously, all of this important work has continued into the Obama administration and now into the Biden administration in a big way. Next slide, please. Now, you've all been really, really patient with me as I've led you through this journey following President Bush's legacy. And I'd like to conclude with a note of optimism and share with you how good things are happening now. We at the EPA are continuing to carry the mantle of protecting the nation from the devastating threats, which we're already seeing, and devastating impacts of climate change, building on this legacy that I've been talking about. Last October, EPA produced its new Climate Adaptation Action Plan, which you see right here, and you can find on EPA's website. The purpose of this plan is to ensure that EPA continues to fulfill its mission of protecting human health and the environment, even as the climate changes and its disruptive impacts are already being felt. Put differently, the way I like to put this isn't about dealing with climate change for the sake of dealing with climate change. This is about protecting human health and the environment in a world in which the climate is changing and is going to continue to change because of human activities. This plan also focuses on helping to increase the resilience of the entire nation to the impacts of climate change as part of a whole of government approach. We work very closely at EPA with other federal agencies in order to coordinate our efforts. And I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that many of our other federal agencies have also released, back in October of 2021, also released their own adaptation plans. Next slide, please. Again, showing you the momentum that's occurring now. Another landmark event occurred this past February when EPA released its new strategic plan. And for the first time ever in any EPA plan in our 50-year history, there is a specific goal focused on tackling the climate crisis. And this goal contains 3 components. The first is focusing on reducing the emissions of greenhouse gases that cause climate change. The second is focused on the area I oversee, which is to accelerate resilience and adaptation to climate change impacts at EPA and across the nation. And the third is focused on advancing our international partnerships in order to deal with the climate crisis internationally. Next slide, please. Now, the proof is always in the pudding, as I like to say. Finally, the Congress has passed landmark legislation that finally provides the financial resources needed by the nation to confront the climate crisis, resources that are needed by states like Texas, local communities, tribes, and indigenous people and territories, with a focus on advancing environmental justice, with a focus on protecting the most vulnerable people and the most vulnerable communities who are often left behind. Last year, the Congress passed and President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And this legislation is focused on rebuilding and maintaining the nation's critical infrastructure. Give you a sense of how big of a deal this is. We at EPA have received over $60 billion to fund these sorts of investments across the nation. And a major imperative for us, as Deputy Administrator Janet McCabe has said, is to ensure that the outcomes of investments made with these funds are resilient to the impacts of climate change. We want to make sure that as scarce taxpayer dollars are spent on rebuilding bridges, roads, and water utilities and other infrastructure, that those investments are made in a climate smart way so that infrastructure will be secure and resilient in a world in which the climate is changing. Next slide. It's a big deal. Also, this past August, the Congress passed and President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, which, among other objectives, and has a lot of objectives, is focused on improving energy efficiency and reducing the emission of greenhouse gases that could contribute to climate change. And once again, we at EPA are working to ensure that the outcomes of investments made with these funds are resilient to the impacts of climate change. For example, as we provide funds so that local communities can buy EV school buses, that we're ensuring that the power stations, the charging places for those electric vehicle buses are not built in flood zones or in areas where we expect there to be flood zones in the future. We're trying to take a sensible integrated approach to the investments that are being made by the nation. Next slide. I'll take a deep breath. I've been bombarding you with a lot of information, and I know I've taken you on a whirlwind tour of several of President Bush's accomplishments and his legacy. And I thought I'd end with a favorite quote of mine, which I really think captures our vision for the future and the future of our children and our grandchildren and how we prepare for that future. And interestingly enough, it's a quote from Wayne Gretzky, a hockey great. Wayne Gretzky said, "I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been." In terms of the climate change work we are doing as a nation, we're no longer assuming that future climate will mirror past climate. We recognize that the climate is changing in unprecedented ways at an increasingly rapid rate. And we have to anticipate for where the climate will be in the future as we make decisions today. For example, as we invest those billions of dollars in new infrastructure. And with that, next slide. With that, I'll end and simply say, please, please, please don't hesitate to contact me directly if I can be of assistance to any of you in the future or answer any other questions you may have down the line. And with that, I'll turn it back to you, Arnie.
Dr. Sharaga, thank you so much for those insightful comments, that wonderful history, and those inspiring remarks. And I'm just sorry that President Bush couldn't hear them himself. I think he was a modest man, but he did some really great works, and you captured a great deal of that, for which we are very grateful. There was a question that arose that I think you might want to tackle. It says, Dr. Sharaga, you mentioned that you learned there are multiple ways to link science to public policy. What are some of the ways and the different contexts in which they might be useful?
It's a great question. And I have several thoughts about it. The first, and again, this represents some of the learning experiences we as a community had going all the way back to the NAPAP assessment, even before dealing with climate change. The first was to acknowledge that there are different types of investments one can make in science. One type of investment, such as the type of investments the National Science Foundation makes, is in basic exploratory research. And that's really critically important, just to identify a lot of the issues, a lot of the problems that we may not even be aware of today. The other type of science is policy-oriented science. And I have to tell you, in the early days of working on climate change, this was a culture change for the science community to recognize, as they were starting to do their scientific research, that it could be focused on policy decisions that were being made either at that point in time or would soon be made by decision makers on the ground. And so it's a very different way of approaching your science. And again, focusing on the question, part of what that means is there has to be a partnership between the scientific researchers, the scientists, and the decision makers from the get-go. They need to hear from the decision makers what the questions were that they were addressing, what the issues were they were addressing, the types of information they needed to make those policy decisions, the form in which the information needs to be delivered, as well as the time frame in which the information had to be provided to the decision makers. And the way I like to say it is, not informing or a policy decision. Well, let me try again. An uninformed policy decision is still a policy decision. If scientists aren't prepared to share their insights about the science, despite existing uncertainties at any point in time, decision makers very often will still go ahead and make their policy decisions. And an informed policy decision is much better than an uninformed policy decision. A couple of other points very quickly, and that is to highlight the importance of partnerships, to recognize that there are other people, other institutions that have a comparative advantage that you as a research institute may not have. And this especially goes for the federal government. We work a lot with universities as we do research to inform policy decisions. Universities like Texas A&M has expertise that we may not have in-house. So we want to invest along with other entities, other organizations, universities, departments, environmental departments in the states, in local communities. A lot of organizations like the Rockefeller Institute, in order to work together as partners to develop the information that can inform policy decisions. So hopefully that just gives you a sense for the culture change that has been going on over time in the federal government and at EPA. It's still continuing to go on, but ways we are beginning to tackle producing the type of scientific information that can inform policy decisions. Let me stop there.
Staying with this theme of science influencing policy, helping to frame the problems and stuff, some other ways, I'll help answer the question as well. Some other ways that science is linked to policy is through, and you kind of implied this, Joel, is through scientists participating, writing reports and providing information for those reports, scientists testifying before Congress, before state legislatures. And I have to tell this story about Dr. Robert M. Gates. Many of you know Dr. Gates as the former Secretary of Defense and Director of the CIA. Many of you may not know that Dr. Gates was the first dean of the Bush School and was also president of Texas A&M University. And I was with him one time when he was asked by a scientist, how do you learn about what we're doing? Do you read our publications in the journal, in the journals? And he said, no, I don't have time to do that. I do, listen to testimony and read kind of summaries of the work that you guys do. But he said the main way that you guys influence, that scholars and academics influence what we do, is by training students and sending them to work for us. Just like you, Joel, that is one of the best ways that university scientists can have an impact, is by doing a great job of training their students, helping their students be successful in governmental careers in that sense. Would you like to elaborate on that? Or
absolutely. You've raised some really important points, Arnie. First of all, in terms of reports, I'll flash back to my comments about the national climate assessments. And those assessments that are being produced by the U.S. Global Change Research Program, again, are not just federal reports, but each chapter is written by folks like yourself, Arnie, experts from universities and other institutions who we bring in to actually write these documents that inform decision makers across the country. And to the credit of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, going all the way back since 1990, those national climate assessments are increasingly starting out by going to the public, going to decision makers, going to mayors, county executives, and others, and saying, what are your needs? What are your information needs? And then they design the national climate assessments in order to try to provide that information in a form that those users indicate they need the information. So Arnie, again, I wholeheartedly second what you said. The second is the importance of training the next generation. And we at EPA are making a concerted effort in our climate change program, for example. We are making a concerted effort to bring in interns into our program, folks who are at universities right now, and giving them the opportunity to work with us to see how we operate in the federal government. But I also have to tell you, a lot of these students are brilliant and bring talent that benefits us at EPA as well. In addition, we're trying to support projects at universities. We did one at Indiana University to help them develop an online computer system to inform decision makers across all of Indiana. It's called the ERIT system, E-R-I-T. One of the things that Indiana University discovered, and we discovered, was that through this project, using the funds that we provided and funds that the university also came up with, they were able to hire undergraduate and graduate students to go out to mayors, county executives, and others to elicit from them, what are the issues of concern to you? Those students then came back and helped to build this system that would provide this information to those decision makers. And it gave them experiences that obviously were invaluable to them in their career development. The last thing that I'll share is an anecdote. And Arnie, I think, I love to share real world anecdotes. And this is one that, again, was transformative for me. And it gets to the question about learning different ways to link science with policy. Going all the way back to the 1990 NAPAP assessment report to Congress. When that assessment came out, Senator Moynihan, the late Senator Moynihan, who was a big supporter of the NAPAP program, held a public hearing, and he invited Dr. Mahoney at the time to come and report on the findings of the NAPAP integrated assessment. And I, as a kid back then, got to go along with Dr. Mahoney, and I was sitting right behind him, watching all the drama play out at this congressional hearing. And I'll never forget, and I should say, Senator Moynihan and Dr. Mahoney were very close friends. Senator Moynihan was a big supporter of the NAPAP program. And I'll never forget, Senator Moynihan at one point asked Jim, so Dr. Mahoney, what have you learned about the implications of acid rain for lakes in New York? Senator was senator from New York. And I'll never forget, Jim immediately, being an outstanding scientist, launched into about a 10-minute explanation in scientific terms about how the acidic neutralizing capacity of the lakes, blah, 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 blah. Moynihan very patiently, Senator Moynihan very patiently listened. And when Jim was done, Senator Moynihan effectively asked the same question again in a different way. Jim, being passionate about correctly conveying the science, basically gave the same type of scientific answer. I'll never forget, at that point, Senator Moynihan leaned over the dais and he said, Jim, are the fish gonna die? And that made a huge impact on me. It still gives me goosebumps because it highlighted for me, that was part of the learning experience that this question asked about. It highlighted the importance for me of understanding, identifying the questions that the decision makers wanted answered, ensuring you design your research to provide those answers, but also delivering that information in a way that is meaningful for the decision maker, for the audience. So I just had to share that anecdote, Arnie.
Oh, that's a great lesson about, how to speak without jargon and to get to the gist of things and really understand where people are coming from. Well, we're at the end of our program. Dr. Sharaga, I just want to thank you so much for your remarks. They were just so impactful, so inspiring to our country, to our young people. And just want to thank you again for your service and all that you're doing for us. it's nice to know that you're there at the helm, kind of helping us navigate these troubled waters. It's so important. And so I'll say goodbye and thank our audience for joining us, and just say be safe and have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.